I'm Micah, it's me, a mediocre white man with opinions who loves grammatical redundancy. This is the second episode in an ongoing series that I'm making where I'm reviewing and ranking 25 years of Pixar movies. The videos are designed so you can basically jump around and watch reviews for specific movies if you want to see them. The ranking element is mostly secondary, but last time I talked about Pixar's misses, the 3 films at the bottom, the ones I think are full-on airballs, whiffing on the hoop and basically not scoring anything at all. Those were Cars 2, Monsters University, and A Bug's Life, but that video also included an introduction to this whole series, so go and watch that one if you haven't already seen it. But thankfully, the great thing about discussing Pixar is that eventually I'm just going to be gushing. At a certain point, you could just hit the randomizer on the order, and there's no reason I'd really argue with you about it. Really, given the strength of their catalog, I think which Pixar film somebody gravitates toward says more about them than the movies. Even though every Pixar film has its shortcomings, I'm going to be spending a lot of time just talking about some really, really great movies. But we're not quite there yet. We're not quite at the bit where I can really start stepping on somebody's toes by ranking something they love below something they hate. Today, we're talking about 3 okay movies that are still, I think, generally regarded as having some fairly major problems while succeeding in other areas. It's the mixed bags, the one where someone is like, you know, I actually really like that one. The word actually is going to be in there. Most people I speak to about these are fairly understanding that they're not for everybody, but from me to those who these do resonate with, I get it, I think. More power to you. I personally find these 3 films have something major about them that I find difficult to get past. That's what I think unites them all together in this little bracket today. These 3 films are Brave, Soul, and Onward. Fine movies that I still think come up against something that mars them in an important area and could make them a hit or miss for anybody. Let's get to it. So first up today is Brave. Merida is the heir to the throne of a medieval Scotland, the firstborn of the king, and a games is held by their allied families to compete for her hand in marriage. Merida's not really a fan of that plan, wants to go on a gap year or something instead, but her mum gets to be a bit of a stick in the mud about tradition and family. So Merida goes to find a witch in a cabin to do something about it. The witch makes her a cake, and the cake turns her wee mum into a bear. And the mum will stay a bear if Merida doesn't repair the bond that was broken between them before the sun rises or something. Her mum and her put aside their differences and decide that she doesn't have to marry, but they do it nice so that the Scottish families don't have a big war. Their mum turns back into her mum, and things are fine after that. I've just fully become Irish now. As the first Pixar film of their chronology to be based in something of the historic past, the first to feature a woman as the central protagonist, and the first to coincide somewhat tonally and setting-wise with a rival studio's release and not demolish it culturally speaking, Brave was synonymous with many a change in the Pixar outlook. They were by now officially owned and operated by Disney when their distribution used to just be Disney, with this release in particular feeling far more like a Disney movie than a Pixar one even to this day. The title even lines up with films like Tangled and Frozen. But by this point, other animation studios had really caught up in the 3D game. How to Train Your Dragon wasn't a Shark Tale, it was a genuine competitor. The days of Pixar seeming to be a godlike, untouchable studio offering what nobody else could were definitively over from this point on. It might have taken DreamWorks a few years. Films like Shrek had their audiences, but was still inundated with pop culture references and more risque humor, which kind of to me dates their work in a way which Pixar's really isn't. But Kung Fu Panda had already showcased some truly brilliant action filmmaking in 2008, which still holds up today. And with How to Train Your Dragon in 2010, DreamWorks had stylistically kind of beaten Brave to the punch by 2 full years. And it did so with style. It's a solid movie with a lot of heart and a lot of imagination, which really had an audience. And despite having a main character performed by an actor who is not a voice actor and serves up his material as if he is actively going to sleep, really followed through with the sequels to become a genuinely beloved trilogy that is mostly quite good. Brave, however, wasn't so enterprising or embraced, and barring, would you have a chance to change your fate, would you do it? Hasn't really seemed to retain general audience interest for the years since. But I guess neither Pixar nor DreamWorks really want to admit that both Brave and How to Train Your Dragon was the result of a lengthy and bloody battle over which one of them was going to readapt Jane and the Dragon, so they just took one half each. Hey now, Jane and the Dragon always That's a niche one, that one. But in terms of Brave's message about womanhood, something of a Freaky Friday concept where the mum and the daughter learn that they're not so different after all, I think has been pretty thoroughly supplanted by the vastly less dicey turning red within Pixar's offerings. And from some viewpoints, Brave is so very snagged on Pixar's occasional too nice attitude. I can't, as a cis man, obviously speak on how this film may have inspired young women when it was released, but from where I'm standing, Brave isn't a movie that just feels like two different films. It kind of has two different messages depending on how you want to look at it. Brave has an admirable stomach, however. On paper and from a distance from the marketing, this film is really cool. I really like just the surface level of this movie rather a lot. It opts for something more of an epic tone, and visually is quite well thought out in an environment sense. The impression it gives you of the kind of film it's going to be is really cool, a lot cooler than what it turned out to be. But the historical iconography, the materials that people are wearing, wood grain, metal textures, landscapes and buildings, and in particular, fur and hair, all look absolutely splendid. Merida's red curls were the focus of entirely new aspects of Pixar technology, and the effect is well worth it, creating a really unique character and contributing to a greatly increased sense of diversity in human appearances for what is probably the first time in Pixar's history, even if I do have some problems with that aspect that I will get to. But here's the catch. Brave, possibly given its troubled production, feels like two different movies at once. And while I like the one about Merida and her mum well enough, it's the other one, the slapstick, overbearing, cheap humor one with more boob jokes in this one movie than the rest of Pixar combined, and its almost unbearably dull supporting cast, which actually grabs more of my attention today. This film is cleaved down the middle, and whoever thought it was a good idea to have this much humor probably wasn't so much to blame as everyone who let them get away with it. It's so silly and so... it's a drag. It's really annoying. With a central conflict which only arrives 40 minutes into a 90-minute movie, Brave's noble epic intentions are buried underneath its own indecision. At once it feels like it wants to become a darker, more mature fantasy story, but that version of it is also being bonked on their head by three red-headed hijinks triplets taking up simply an unreasonable amount of screen time, and Brave is hard to invest in and harder to remember because of it, because it doesn't even feel like it commits to what it's going for. Pacing is the key issue here. As mentioned, the part of the story where Eleanor, Merida's mum, becomes a bear and them needing to navigate that amidst the confusion about an old mystical demon bear who bitten off Fergus's, Merida's dad's leg 10 years ago, arrives to rear its head basically halfway through the movie, which to begin with seemed to be about a family drama based in a fantasy Scotland. The bear sections are definitely the most focused of the film, with the regal animation of the queen bear being a strong and well navigated choice, giving a lot of character. But it still arrives far too late for it not to feel jarring, and the returning to the larger cast after this point feels really underwhelming. As a result of not actually spending that much time with this concept also, the growth between Merida and Eleanor feels like their bitterness resolves really quickly because it only plays out over a few scenes. Their growth back together begins too late into the film to feel genuine or like their feud to begin with wouldn't have been easily solved some other way. In contrast to Soul, another movie we're talking about today, Joe Gardner basically dies 10 minutes into that movie and we get to the concept basically right away. The pace of it is so much more in tune with what the film's actually about than this. But the bear stuff on its own is okay, but of the two sides, I honestly think the more serious period piece about Merida's family, which does away with an adventure aspect, is more compelling from a distance. It'd be easy to get into that moody fairy tale idea before the things change. Pixar apparently regularly retreating to the wacky hijinks and an adventure plot honestly feels like some cowardice going on. The bear stuff arrives at a time where it feels like they ditched the movie they only half decided to make in favor of something way more conventional. The only other movie I've seen which did this same restless thing of changing what the movie is halfway through was Hereditary, and the abruptness of the tonal shift, but also the genre change of the story after it's already gotten emotional investment is major whiplash on multiple fronts, and you lose a swath of your audience who feel like they're suddenly watching a different movie than the one they had been 10 minutes ago and don't understand why it's changed. There's some prophecy about an old legend and some four brothers who fought, and a demon bear, and a will-o'-the-wisp, and a witch in the forest, and a lot of spooky lore stuff to extend the world and make the world feel bigger, and the themes about fate appear larger than they are, but not a lot of the execution actually supports that. All of this is at odds with each other. Brave's fluttering tone makes it so that much of that sense of scale ends up feeling like window dressing over a lack of guts. It's a slapstick comedy with a weak mother-daughter story, under the delusion that world lore makes up the difference dramatically, as if every moment of serious fantasy storytelling needs to be offset equally with a joke. It's kind of not picking a tone, and it doesn't feel earnest. It feels a little bit ashamed of itself, and that might be the result of the troubled production, but hey, I'm talking about finished multi-million-dollar projects from proven entities today, so we'll see how much patience I have for that on this film to film. It's written its characters to serve their purposes, but not the story itself. The guys don't even know where the prize is. This is the core issue with the film to me. Brave feels like it isn't only fighting against an apparent need for weak humor to add levity to the bolder setting, but it also changes its mind about its plot halfway through, and its dialogue is more concerned with the tacked-on themes of fate and destiny than creating authentic characters who communicate and emote. This film is distracted by its need to be more epic, and it misses actually articulating itself basically at all. The film is situated in a more complex place, but actively resists that maturity. Having some lore doesn't really save the film from it allowing individual scenes to take way too long. It's overuse of environments and it's stretching the characters way past their limits whilst underwriting the moment-to-moment scenes. In terms of visuals, Brave is an accomplished visual piece, and while I think my preference might play a big part in my issues with the film's character designs, I do also think the more grounded, realistic, and mystical setting here is underserved by these obvious wacky character choices. It lends an annoying sense of caricature and stereotype to the legions of underwritten supporting people in the cast, but the film's continual slapstick and visual humor relies on its cartoony choices for them when none of it lands anyway, and it's in direct tonal conflict with the setting. How do you expect dramatic moments to register when it's occupied by this cast of cartoonishly vacant cutouts? But like I led with, the message of this film is actually kind of dicey when you think about it. From a distance, it might seem apparent that the journey was for Merida to reject the traditional role of a woman in a patriarchal society, or that young folks should be allowed to write their own destinies, but I'm not sure the film successfully conveys that or posits that really at all. As I understand it, when the film opens, Merida is a happy, driven 16-year-old woman who knows what she likes to do, how she likes to spend her time, and is generally pretty pleased with the way things are going. She seems nice enough. Her independence is an admirable trait. These are things that I like about her. She might be proud and loud and stubborn, but within this larger cast, those are pretty common things, and I'm able to see how she's a product of her environment and upbringing while still having an identity of her own. Merida at the beginning of the film might be where, logically, any other character would end up at the end of their story. She's at a point of self-actualization. She's independent. She's assertive. She's talented, physically capable, smart. She's fiery. I've heard that some folks think she's too aggressive and that makes her unlikable, but I don't feel the same.
Maybe some people just have a problem with feminine rage.
Any emotional progression basically from the point she's at the start of the movie isn't something I feel I need to see because she doesn't actually have any significant enough character flaws. Eleanor, her mum, ends up pushing her instead of accepting her, but fixing that is framed as being Merida's responsibility, not Eleanor's. Merida didn't really do anything wrong. She's fine. Again, I think the confused writing here is to blame because while she might be mean to her mum and disregarding of the traditional station and manners which her mum tells her are a woman's duty to uphold, that's like fine. I don't have a problem with that. Every single man in this movie is an unlikable, useless goof, and their bonds to each other absolutely fall apart when there are no women in the room. And Brave kind of suggests and shows that Merida's ability to steady them isn't only a worthy pursuit but a necessary one. The girl is the one who needed to evolve for the sake of everybody else. Eleanor is trying to impose on Merida standards that no men are required to measure up to in this story at all, and the film seems to convey that Merida bending even slightly to those expectations to basically make peace with her role within the society is character progression and not regression. There's the one scene where the younger men of the clans voice their agreement with Merida's point of view, that they were also just following tradition, that they should also be allowed to choose their fates, and they didn't necessarily want to marry her either, which gives us a bit of a tinge of, oh, so it's a problem when the girl says it but not the boys, and seems to imply that it's only the forced marriage that was a problem and not the everything else, not the entire alliance relying on one young woman being self-effacing when she shouldn't have to be, to make up for everyone else not having their fucking head screwed on. At the end of the film, in terms of Merida's actual emotional journey, things aren't actually super resolved. They don't talk about where she's at. She comes to realize that Eleanor's transformation into a bear was because she was ungrateful for her mum, disregarding of the bonds between the families, and because she sheds herself of her pride before sunrise, that mends the bond between them, and her mum turns back. As the film presents it in the moment, it all seems harmless. Young people should be free to forge their own destinies and choose their own paths. If that means breaking with traditions, that's okay, as long as they understand the fullness of their decision to do so and keep an eye on the effect their own life decisions may have on those around them. Be wary of your responsibilities, basically. Is fine, I guess, but also by Eleanor eventually agreeing with Merida's resistance to tradition, but Merida's needing to present it in the right way, the film is kind of saying two things at once. It's selfish for you to make a choice for yourself, but if you get your mum's permission first, that same outcome is okay. It's weird and dicey and strange. Given how quickly the film wraps up after Eleanor turns back, not really saying anything about the newfound bond between them apart from them riding some horses, Brave doesn't really elaborate on what it means by any of this. It turns its focus immediately back to fate and destiny, and these three red-headed pricks not being funny instead of the actual character's journey. Brass tacks, Merida is the only likable character in the movie to me, and she starts off the film as already a qualified badass. She might be loud and demanding, but those are not flaws, they are traits, they are aspects. The film wants to challenge her point of view without giving her one that needed to be corrected. But as I mentioned, I think on the specific relationship between mothers and daughters, Turning Red is just obviously much more clear about what it's actually saying. Tradition and honoring your family is important, but it shouldn't come at the cost of independence and making your own choices, and parents do need to let their kids go at some point. Brave's unclear, cloudy arc about no kids, maybe you actually do need to toe the line and be grateful when your parents put their foot down and don't listen to you isn't only something I don't agree with, it contradicts other Pixar media and doesn't seem to understand what makes young adult fiction connect with audiences at all. YA fiction draws in its audiences because it's the kids who are standing up to adults. The kids need to be in the right. I respect Brave's stomach, I like the look of it, I enjoy its epic sensibilities in some ways, and its unique identity within the Pixar lineup, and see that they probably were trying something different with this and know that the movie has its audience somewhere. But there are just so many things here that I don't understand. The emphasis on and the overuse of the humor is annoying and distracting and completely unfunny, despite the movie basically going for a joke every few moments. Very, very few of them land, and it seems to come at the cost of any ability to emotionally invest in the world or its people. The characters are annoying and weakly written, the story is focusing on its overarching themes of destiny and fate, and forgets to solidify the individual characters' arcs with resolution. It's got tonal inconsistencies and pacing problems coming out of its ears. It's a visual feast, and likely many of the tech advancements assisted Pixar in further improving the weight and the feeling of their films environmentally and with clothing in particular, but Brave is a confused, slow, unengaging Pixar film that dances its way out of memory almost immediately. On paper, a lot of Brave is extremely cool. I would have loved for this setting and this character to be in a much better film than the one we got. Alright, it's Soul time. Joe Gardner, a failing professional jazz pianist and music teacher, dies. Resisting the call to move on from this mortal coil, Joe finds himself instead in the Great Before, a place where souls are before they become people on Earth, and through interacting with number 22, a soul who's been unable to find their spark for life for a long time, Joe is called on to reflect on what his life had been while he tries to claw it back and return to the world so as to play at his dream jazz gig. The premise is easy to explain there, but the beat by beat of this movie a little less so. But discovering the nature of life, death, birth, and the zone, a meditative in between the physical and spiritual, Joe and 22 go on an adventure back on Earth where 22's soul is inside Joe's body and Joe's is inside of a cat, before Joe comes back to life, plays his gig, and realizes that his life hasn't been leading to one single moment, but has been a sum of all moments. And after helping 22 find the courage to live their life back on Earth in the Great Before, Joe makes peace with the here and now, finding contentedness in what is in place of yearning for what may eventually be. At certain points, as we climb up my ranking in this list, in my opinion, there's a few noticeable jumps, benchmarks if you will. As we get to Soul, there's a definite shift. For the record, I don't think Pixar have ever made a fully bad movie. I've seen bad movies and bad animation, and this is a studio who literally just don't and haven't ever produced something that's really actually properly bad or regressive cinema. If you don't agree with that, I'm not sure your bar for quality is in the right spot. The most they could be accused of is occasional mediocrity, but in the grand scheme of movie making, nothing Pixar has produced has been offensive to the senses, wholly repugnant, or even so much as coming across as half-heartedly made. There might be films in their catalog that aren't awesome, but no Pixar movie is a bad movie. The 4 films I've discussed already are certainly fine, okay movies. It's just personally, I'm not sure they're films I would say are a worthwhile use of your time to sit down and watch. But as we get to Soul, that recommendation changes. From here on up, no remaining Pixar movie would be a waste of your time to watch, in my opinion. That includes this one. You're going to get something out of this and every other movie. It might not be the highlight of your week, but this would be an evening quite well spent. You're going to get a visually arresting and a beautifully animated film here, with specific touches like accuracy on musical instrument performance, film grain and bokeh during the Earth sections, African-American skin and hairstyles, cast diversity and mood lighting that will absolutely knock your socks off. Soul is a very impressive and slick piece of visual production. You're going to get a message that is worth hearing about living every minute of your life, and a Hollywood production which actually speaks about the reality of adulthood careers as opposed to childhood dreaming, which cuts to the heart of something honestly quite mature, and in something very close to direct opposition to the Hollywood dream in and of itself. The meaning of this film is very worthwhile and is conveyed at times with a gentle power. You're going to get a rather unique protagonist, actually, one who's openly flawed, openly ordinary, who subverts a lot of the standards for who these films are usually about. In many ways, that's my favorite aspect of Soul. Joe Gardner himself is a wonderfully developed and portrayed character whose failed ambitions and age makes him a unique choice for Pixar. And in all honesty, seeing a film of this type about an unmarried adult man who doesn't have kids, trying to work in a creative field, who feels like he's missed a lot of his opportunities, hits a lot of buttons for people like me. Placing this protagonist into a moody, independent work usually makes sense, but here, it honestly feels like a risk, and I want to congratulate that. A lot of that helps people feel seen, I think. I also anticipate that its New York setting might feel authentic to those who've lived or been there. I certainly know that it hits a lot of distinctly New York beats that might be appreciated. It has some terrific music from the likes of Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, with also Jon Batiste on some incredible piano moments, creating a cross-section between floaty, exciting, ethereal jazz piano and melancholy synth work, which often just straight up steals the show, or is entirely the difference between scenes working and scenes not. You're gonna get, honestly, a film with a couple of really great laughs. I really like the approach to humor in this movie. It's sharply written and edited, seeing a few fun opportunities afforded by its setting, but not pushing the envelope or going overboard. And obviously, Soul is a quite recent movie. In my initial rewatch of the Pixar catalog in its entirety was actually only the second time that I'd seen it. Watching it again for this video, I found that I enjoyed it rather a lot more than I had initially. This is a good movie that I genuinely feel some people might really, really love and possibly even really need. But to me, I do think for as many differences as Soul presents from the Pixar formulas, it's also victim to just as many. And whilst being a good time, I can't really ignore the sense of a manufactured nature which permeates this very careful feeling, often slightly distracted work. There's another Pixar movie that has a similar sort of sheen like this that I'll be talking about at another time, but with these higher concept Pixar movies, it feels like there's a knife's edge you need to walk on, and Soul might be the one I'm not as convinced balances itself well enough. Let me put it like this. Soul is a movie with a bushel of tennis balls in its arms which decided to stand in the middle of a dog park. It gets out alive, but it spends every second screaming and running away from the pugs like it didn't know what the matter was. The team who made it decided to attempt to tackle concepts of death, the afterlife, the nature of personality, souls, the arena of pre-birth, the meaning of life and the value of human experience, and yet it feels at most moments as if it's terrified of that position. I think almost every choice that it makes from the top down of its story is a laser light show attempting to distract any given audience member of the potential substantial weight of its own themes, and I'm not sure what the idea was to tell a story about death if it results in a film which feels like it has piss running down its leg half the time. I can certainly understand the need for a cat and a body swap and fun jazz breaks. I enjoy that. A plot about the reason for living and the beauty of the world. It works in the moment, and on certain days I'm fine with letting it distract me. But the story is about a guy who fucking dies, and the reality or darkness of the many further concepts branching out from there is something Soul seems deliberately tight-lipped about and terrified of. Let me just go for the throat. I'm not here to waste time. If Soul posits that people have personalities before they're born, does Soul say that life begins at conception? What are you doing? Why would you put yourself in that position? Joe's mum a couple times brings up pensions and health insurance. But the guy dies but wasn't seriously injured, and he went to a hospital without worrying about how he was gonna pay for that. I thought this was America. Soul, all at once, feels like a beautiful reflection of the depth of human expression, which plainly rejects the necessity of informing human belief systems into its depiction of its highest concepts, and the inherent division that differing approaches to these things gives rise to between people. Doing so when dealing with a story about death and birth betrays the film's lack of ambition and exposes its deliberately sterile treatment of the most vulnerable place that every one of us will one day come to be. Take the root of all philosophy and make walking through its fields look like the background from Tiny Wings. Refuse to inform death and life from a cultural place in a movie about its beauty. I can't help but feel a message about living every moment of your life that you feel isn't what you want feels easy coming from the mouth of a film so openly working around almost any realistic complications. I know that none of the heavy themes about death and life and personality are really what the movie is about, and it tells what story it is concerned with quite well, a good story, but I don't know if I'm convinced that it needed to wade into such murky territory to get its message across. I don't know if this story and these characters are actually the best vehicle to deal with these concepts anyway. I don't know if this tone works in the face of death. There needs to be a balance here, and a story about a guy trying to refine his fervor for life doesn't need him to die and then befriend an unborn person and then betray them and save them in order to do it. There's a good movie here. There's just also a bunch of death shit that is entirely separate to it. I get that it's a bit of a running theme with which Pixar films that I enjoy, where I kind of rub up against the ones with more transparent attempts to appeal to the younger audiences. I'm not against all ages entertainment, but I don't want to watch a family film pull its punches if it doesn't need to. And I'm not a parent, but I have been a child, and I did grow up watching many of these films, and I can promise you, if one of these films was darker and had darker humor and confronted its thematics more head-on, as a kid watching the movie, I'm not going to notice that it's scary and heavy. I'm just going to notice that it's a better movie. And as I grow, I'll slowly begin to understand more of the depth in its depiction of the concepts, precisely because it was beyond my understanding. Kids notice these things, but they don't have that full understanding of them. They can't intellectualize why something is heavy, they just take it in. It's not really just risque jokes that go over a kid's head, it's dark stuff too. That's not a problem, that's a potential strength, and it's something that Soul seems regrettably disregarding of. It can so successfully put its every nuance into one small anecdote. Joe is regularly stating the themes or his mood out loud to himself. It feels like it tries to make everything really difficult to miss so that it doesn't have to let you stew with the concepts on your own and take them further than the film wants you to. Dissecting the nature of the afterlife and telling an African-American story is awesome, but to tell a story about a dead black man who lives in black communities in America, who stood at the gates of the great beyond to not once mention Jesus, is so back-breakingly gymnastic that it's almost impressive. To decide to deal with death in a film which deliberately prunes itself to have the most vague, most inoffensive, and least religious or spiritual version of events that could be, is one which feels like it's working very hard to not say anything. This is emphasized by the sheer difference of the visual approach between the Great Before and the Earth itself. One is rich and golden and full, teeming with culture, and that is the film's premier strength. The other is attempting to be as clinical and beige as possible. Literally taking inspiration from MacBook desktop icons. I get that the difference is the point and is what ends up giving 22 their spark, but it still feels like spirituality and heaven by committee. How do we include the least religion possible here? How do we make the movie about dying but keep our tail so far between our legs that you can't see it? Make every dead person on the Travulator an old person who is ready to die. Yeah, that rings true, doesn't it? How do we make the movie about jazz and black communities have almost exactly half of it ignore those spaces? How do we cover our ass by saying the Great Before and beyond is a hypothetical place, even though we've seen and made a more interesting cultural depiction of death before. I think in order to cover this up, Soul not only centers much of its story around a protagonist who is desperate to live and therefore unwilling to discuss death at all, it helps the film avoid it, but it borrows leaves from many of the other Pixar books for its various moments to make it feel more familiar, more homely, more Pixar-y, and at times it works, but it still feels like a shallow approach to a broad, important concept of life and death. The choices it makes doesn't really allow it to take advantage of what's unique about it, and the metaphysics of the world that it builds matters less and less as the film goes on. It's got the dreamer artist element of Ratatouille. It's got the musician angle and the death and afterlife angle that Coco covered already. You've got the troubled, older, flawed male protagonist seen in a great many Pixar films, Incredibles and Nemo chiefly. You've got the existentialism and the turning of a figurative human experience into a literal place of Inside Out. You've got the let's tour around that environment checking off boxes in every other Pixar movie since Finding Nemo. You've got the unlikely pairing of companions with different life outlooks from you name it. Soul didn't really seem to realize that what I want is the mature single adult protagonist dissecting what he feels about mortality, which it knows is the heart and it does eventually get to. But in the meantime, its attempts to redirect its slower, more contemplative and reflective setup into something hopeful about life instead feels more like a cop-out than a solution. It somehow nails the message of living every moment of your life whilst failing to deal with the reality of death. It weakens itself by its need for a happy ending despite saying that that isn't the point. By giving itself the toolbox of Pixar tropes to solve the problems the story setup presented, Soul feels like it treads a lot of familiar territory in order to avoid the situation it put itself in, and provides a message which is both wonderful but also very, very broad, with an execution that's hard to nail down and actually interrogate. Pixar's need to appeal to such a broad market, I think, really bit them on the ass here, unwilling or unable to grow up a little and follow through with an actual conviction on its incredibly meaty concept in a specific, cultured way. I'm not honestly exactly sure what I'm asking for. Soul is a pretty okay movie, which could be accused mostly of being meek and a little manufactured in the face of its own choices. It's still mostly a good time while you're watching. Whether I'm going to be in the mood for it just depends on the day. I do find its humor, again, very strong. Its disconnection of voices from bodies is interesting in how little it matters, and noticing that Richard Ayoade says cray cray in this movie might be the highlight of my life. Soul is a direct and serviceable film. It's a good movie, but it feels a little bit like a miner walking into a very intense nightclub. You know it's gonna be a lot. You know you're gonna need to ask yourself questions, and the vibe is gonna be confronting. You can hide in the bathroom about it, you can keep your blinders on and focus on the 1 or 2 square inches of floor you feel okay grooving on, or you can peace out and go to a different party that feels like it's a bit more your speed. Maybe go to the jazz club and stay there. I just don't know why Soul walked into such heavy thematics if it didn't feel up to the task, especially if it was going to repeat so many elements from previous movies in order to do it. There had to be a better way to use the best aspects of this film. There had to be a more fitting story about this character and these terrific jazz elements. Even the body swap stuff is cool. There had to be a place where it would have been easier to enjoy what this film so clearly has to offer and ignore where it so clearly draws the line. In a fantasy world, which, after everything, still sided with Edison, the suburban elf Ian Lightfoot is turning 16. He's got his Neil Sedaka going, got a pretty okay life with his mom Laurel, her partner Colt, and his dungeon master history buff brother Barley. But at this time feels a little melancholy over the missing part of his life, that being his courage and his pride. He wants to grow up a little bit, and these traits apparently belonged to his late father quite centrally. His father passed away when he was a baby. Laurel unveils that Ian and Barley's father had left a gift for them to be given when they were both over 16, which turns out to be a magical staff, a spell component called a Phoenix Gem, and a spell which will allow their dad to return for 24 hours to visit them to see who his sons grew up to be. But it turns out it's not the fantasy nut Barley who's the magically inclined of the two, it's Ian, and while the spell initially fizzles halfway through, leaving their dad as just a pair of legs, they embark on a quest of yore to find another Phoenix Gem to finish the spell, and while it ends up being Barley alone who's able to say goodbye to his father like he wasn't able to as a kid, Ian finds the courage and pride within himself that was there there all along and begins to understand the role that his brother has played in his life as a mentor and lifelong friend. Onward isn't a movie that I think, for the record, has any significant issues holding it back from achieving its vision. I think it's a very confident film that definitely succeeded in getting where it wanted to go. It's just that maybe it's a case of that vision having been somewhat quaint to begin with. At least it's kind of presented as being such. Dan Scanlon, who also directed Monsters University, helmed this project, and has occasionally spoken about how, while Monsters U was a project he enjoyed, wasn't necessarily a space he felt able to put a personal stamp on. Onward, however, was, and it definitely comes across as a film which benefits from his energetic and well-paced touches, and it utilizes a similar eye for color and bright round tones that Monsters U did in a more measured way perhaps. It kind of feels like a more full visual project when it's paired with something which grounds it this well emotionally, and Scanlon has spoken much about how this film was quite a personal love letter of his own to his late father and his own relationship with his brother. And that love really comes across in this movie, I think. If Onward is a film which makes safe choices, it's one which does so consistently in service of its story. At every chance, every fork in the road that it comes to, it always makes the call to serve the plot, serve the narrative, serve the characters in the most assured way that it can. It'll serve that story above all else, even if it means swerving away from potential heights or opportunities, because it knows what it wants to do, and it's going to get there no matter the cost. The film is like, we're going to work in Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing elements, but we're going to stop the second that things get too complicated or indulgent. Only employ as much as you need to serve the story. Only show spells when they're needed as a solution to an immediate problem. Introduce them one at a time. Make sure they're used to their fullest in that moment and are multifunctional to both solve a problem, but also create a joke or a further story moment. No spell will be here that absolutely doesn't need to be here, because we're not building a world, we're telling one story about one family. We're going to work in the secondary plot about Laurel, the boy's mum, following them with a manticore who's going to help them kill a cursed dragon they'll run into at the end of their Phoenix Gem quest. But we're going to make sure that the dragon has a big center core, so as to focus all of the action around one very easily understandable goal. The emotional climax is already the visitation spell. We've been working up to that the entire movie, and if we overload the action, we will detract from that. We're going to include certain action-adventure movie tropes, Indiana Jones style dungeon crawling and puzzle solving, but the solutions are going to be quick, uncomplicated, easy to explain and enact, because what matters is that the brothers work together to solve their problems and grow through those trials, not that the puzzles be interesting, mystical, original, or important. Making these calls this consistently ensures that Onward feels like a very safe film. It's definitely lacking in originality and isn't especially complex, but to me, it never feels like that's to its detriment in any major moment. It ensures that it gets to the finish line comfortably without ever losing steam or sight on what matters to it. I understand the film's inclinations and would swear I think its consistency is to its benefit as a whole emotional work, which mattered to its director. I respect that. I don't know if Onward quite reaches the heights of many other Pixar entries, even ones I've spoken about already, but it for sure doesn't have many of the lows either. I really do appreciate consistency in media. Doesn't feel like it has any major cracks for me to crawl into and bust it open with. Onward knows what it thinks is important, and it's not original and maybe not that interesting to you, but my goodness, I'm gonna reward the sense of assured, steadfast conviction that this movie is gleaming with. I really love how the animation in this film gives such a physical feeling to everything that's happening. For example, the initial character introductions in the Lightfoot home is a beautifully choreographed interaction between all of them, which tells multiple stories at once and lets you in on a lot of how close this family is while showing a lot of their differences. The dialogue tells one story and setup for the movie, but the bodies and the movement is giving another equally important one at the same time. Laurel is a trendy mom who's a little dorky but knows her sons very well and is comfortable around them, shown by her roughhousing and jokes, and they love her too. Barley is a dude who's inherited that play-fighting nature, big in theatrical movements, sweeping Ian up with his grand showman-like gestures, but maybe doesn't respect his personal space all that much. Colt is an awkward stepdad centaur who's not as assured around the boys, and importantly, isn't super in tune with his own body. His horse movements feel more like an inconvenience than something that he's used to. He's very heavy. It's subtle, but it's there. And Ian is more gangly and awkward and doesn't have the same loud or boisterous qualities as his mom or brother, shown in how many times his breakfast is spilled accidentally by somebody else and they don't notice. He doesn't say anything, he just picks it up and tries again. He used the last of the cereal already the first time, so he goes to make toast instead. It says a lot about, honestly, his lack of self-respect in that physical story while surrounding him with several other very physically dominant characters. And that feeling of weight and bounce continues throughout the entire movie. The physical weight of everything in this film is conveyed so very, very effectively. Barley climbing atop his van Guinevere to have a look around for a gas station, and the van hobbling seemingly happily beneath him. Ian's arm being grappled by the chain and the car chase rippling backward, which the sound design also sells really well. Everything about that Manticore mascot costume, that thing is hilarious. And on the note of the physical in this movie, actually, honestly, I am super here for the body positivity in this movie. I really, really like this. There's a wide dynamic of body types on all sorts of characters, and yet no sense of judgment or stereotype associated with any of it. Animation has kind of historically, even in Pixar's history, used bodies and body types as a very quick visual rundown on what kind of character this is. There's further connotations associated with that. Animation can unfortunately lean into visual profiling and create or go from judgments, but Onward does kind of the absolute opposite of that. There's a few times where Barley's mentioned as being the bigger of the two brothers, and it's something he owns and seems to like about himself. But there's also a character trait of him being a comfort eater. When he's in emotional stress, he pulls over to a vending machine. It's a little story here, a little aspect of the character implied visually, which feels like an honest human reaction to a difficult moment, letting us in on how he deals with his emotions. But it's not mined for tasteless jokes or looked down on at all. And a wide array of body types from characters alongside the real lack of villains in this movie gives off this whole really kind vibe to this movie that I am very, very into. I think it's great. Not every movie needs to feel like this, obviously, but there's a potent lack of malcontent here, which ensures that the atmosphere of the film feels fun, and the moments of tension in the relationships feel more honest and real because they're not being overshadowed by caricature or judgment. Other touches that stood out to me included Barley removing his beanie when talking about his final memory of his dad, signifying him being more open, and removing his shield and affect to be vulnerable with Ian. The choice to include a diary in which Ian writes, and rather a lot of writing and signage in the whole film, is actually more significant than you might think. Given Pixar's absolute need to localize for international markets, having English writing or signage that can be simplified so as to not have to animate the shot with different languages every time is a really big undertaking for an entire localization animation department. The choice to have a diary here is significant, and I respect what would probably have been something that folks had to fight and work hard for. Recent Pixar films have a rather annoying habit of showing characters welling up just the perfect amount sometimes, and it can feel a little artificial here as well. But the touch of having Barley get tears in his eyes when Ian is walking over the bottomless pit and physically fighting back his open fear while still needing to speak and call out like everything is okay is absolutely gripping, and his falling to his knees relief when Ian gets to the other side completely sells that moment. Like, he's watching his own brother in a very, very deadly situation, and just his physical reaction to that is so convincing. The dragon being a cloud curse at the end of the movie, which grabs things in its environment and like grabs the walls of the school to build itself, is really, really cool. But using the school bell as the dragon's roar is absolutely inspired. That feels like the kind of approach that Onward has chosen. Because it knows the lane it's in might not be an especially complex one, it does a great job selling its moments in ways which really work for it instead. I didn't super have that much of an emotional connection to the Guinevere van, but the tire bursting and it galloping along, I absolutely have to pay that. That is just fantastic. Onward is potentially a more subjective film in its appeal for these reasons. Maybe if you're just annoyed that it's not particularly original, it's not going to do much for you. Or maybe its emotional sting will come into play more for certain people than others. It feels like a movie you'd enjoy the most if you were looking for it. It's for boys with brothers what Frozen might be for girls with sisters. It's like a delightful reminder of the importance of having a strong familiar bond in that place, being nice to each other, and the particular conflict, but also the love that having a sibling gives rise to. That's not to say you need to have lost a parent or be a sibling to relate to this film, but I think those who have and who are might find more in this film to relate to. I honestly don't know if anybody who might have a more complicated relationship with their siblings or parents would find the weight of this movie that sufficient to really speak much to them, but for a general audience, and certainly for its director, it seems, Onward's message about, hey, go hug your brother, they're not that bad and they love you too, is very, very sweet. But in terms of what's holding this film back, I'm not sure there's anything super significant, at least nothing the film isn't okay with, because it doesn't feel like it's going for anything which would have been all that challenging for the studio to capture. This is evidenced by them yet again going for a family story of them always in the movie, making the safe, uncomplicated call. Nothing significant makes the movie boring or interesting, but a whole lot of those minor things, again, might really bug somebody. For me, it depends on the day. Am I fine with watching a fairly formulaic, if not well-made film today? If you want something more substantial, more interesting, or more challenging, and more complex, Onward isn't going to provide that to you really much at all. I think the family being a single unit obviously helps it focus, but how does Bali run tabletop games without a party of friends? And what kind of 16-year-old doesn't have one other friend? Basically, the character building prior to the film's start can feel a bit underdeveloped. I do, again, think Ian sitting on the cliff with the diary and having an epiphany, while crucial to the story in its execution, feels a little bit more like it's out of obligation than a genuinely motivated moment, and doesn't honestly feel fully earned. It's as if it needs a Pixar moment. This is the bit where you cry. This is your designated cry time. While the finale of Ian watching Bali say goodbye to their dad from afar is beautiful and feels like a much more sincere version of that, but here on the cliff at least, it does the thing that Soul also does of reaching further back than has actually been shown in the film for the emotional punch. Going back and showing you things like Ian and Bali as really small kids that we haven't seen to give it more weight at the very last minute. And it feels a little cheap. It's as if it's shooting higher on the emotional scale than it's given itself the tools to actually reach. And while the film is very focused on the relationship between Bali and Ian, it's the central disc of the movie, and it succeeds in getting there probably. I think that spot is probably the bit where Onward could have stepped a bit further out of its comfort zone. And to focus on that, I want to talk about the biggest trend that I think Onward broke for Pixar. The biggest rule I think that they changed, and that was in regard to casting. In almost every other scenario, Pixar have cast celebrities and famous actors in their major roles a lot, but it's never really felt like celebrity casting, never really as a selling point. They're not gonna hire Jason Derulo for no reason, or have extended opening credit scenes with the actors' names taking up the whole of the screen. Even the original Toy Story had a title card and skipped out on the "we got Tom Hanks, look, Tom Hanks" movie. It doesn't really have that. When they cast, they just pick the right voice for their part. If that happens to be Tom Hanks, hey, you look me in the eye and tell me you hear any other voice coming out of that head. You might know who Albert Brooks is if you saw him down at the Hammock District, but they're not putting the names of the actors at the top of their posters and marketing their projects because James Corden is the rabbit. How fun. Maybe given their reputation, they just don't need to, which might be a luxury that some other studios just can't afford. But I'll always believe that specialized voice actors will do a better job than star power celebrity in most every scenario of actually serving the material. And it's always better to just pick the right voice for the part. If that happens to be Amy Poehler, that's just fine. Pixar do celebrity names, but not miscast celebrities. Owen Wilson as Lightning McQueen might have felt like that at the time, but I honestly can't imagine a different voice for that character anymore. These things have a way of evolving and going back and forth. I don't really hear Ellen, I hear Dory because of the energy that she provides to that performance. Pixar have historically used actors from in-house also, folks who kind of don't do any voice work but with them because they just mainly work in other departments. Lou Romano, the voice of Linguini in Ratatouille and Bernie in The Incredibles, has had a very long career in various Disney art departments. Bonnie Hunt, the voice of Cars Sally and Toy Story's Dolly, has had an on-screen career, but basically hasn't done anything but voice work for animation and specifically Pixar since 2006. And as for child roles for younger characters like Dash, Nemo, Russell, Andy, they almost always hire actual children who then put themselves into that role. They speak naturally and they give their own energy to the character. And this pool of exclusivity, the discerning nature of their casting and the rarity of celebrities just for their own sake is a very major difference in my opinion between Pixar from virtually any other Western animator at this level. They don't market their films based on names and the characters don't sound like actors you will see or hear anywhere else. Kung Fu Panda has Jack Black who's awesome and Ian McShane similarly, but The Furious Five and Dustin Hoffman, maybe Seth Rogen, but mostly no. Hire voice actors for your own sake. Why is Dustin Hoffman here? The dude does not know how to voice act. However, Onward breaks that tradition and that sentiment for Pixar by casting Tom Holland and Chris Pratt in the two major roles. Initially for me, this was the biggest hurdle that I needed to get past to enjoy this movie. Potentially it's the case that the characters were very solid in the script already, and Pixar and Scanlon might have been looking for actors to perform specific material as opposed to picking people they could write material material for, but it still just feels like a very different choice for Pixar. It doesn't feel like something they do. Tom Holland of Spider-Man fame is the voice of Ian. I certainly don't think he's a bad actor. I just don't know if he's been a particularly discerning one so far. I know he's got a very active agent who gets him a lot of work, but I've never seen Tom Holland give a performance I felt that only he could give. He's a phenomenal athlete, which is something Onward doesn't really call for, and he's got a wide array of roles that he could play, but it hasn't really felt like he's been in something that he was the best potential choice for that part, at least nothing I've seen him in. He's a predictable, dependable working actor who will serve your story well enough. He just, in my opinion, has yet to give a performance which actually elevated a work. Predictability from a performer isn't bad, it just indicates comfort, safety, and I tend to think when I see him on a poster that the project could probably be fine, but I'm not going to watch it to see him in it. Chris Pratt has the exact same sort of vibe to me, with maybe more of an experienced touch to it. He's a very easy person to meme on these days, but jokes aside, the dude has charisma and charm as a performer, a very practiced comedic ability which he knows exactly where to dial, depending on what a project might call for. He certainly can go more intense, but he can do light fare also. He made the Lego movie what it was, and he alone, in my opinion, is what gave Guardians the push that it needed. I've never seen a Jurassic World movie. I'm very disappointed Charles Martinet isn't playing Mario in the movie, but I've got no real problem with Pratt as a performer. These are two actors with proven on-screen chemistry with each other, proven box office dependability, proven appeal to the film's target market, proven talents in a certain type of role, and Pratt has rather a lot of voice acting experience. Holland as the younger, unconfident kid, and Pratt as the warm, theatrical older brother certainly feels like something you expect. You're going to get some nice apple pie on a Sunday afternoon after church. What it is a functional choice. You feel like you're probably going to get, and we certainly do get, two actors serving the material at an acceptable level. But what it isn't is risky, and what it isn't is interesting. It's safe to serve the story, but it doesn't feel like either of these parts or the actors are being pushed to be the most that they could be. And given that they're the film's focus, I think that maybe that could have happened with different performers. There was definitely a 16-year-old out there in the world who could have performed Ian with a degree of honesty and power that transcends what Holland provides here, and also sounds more unique than him. One that doesn't sound, unfortunately, like he's acting. There was for sure a 20-year-old who would have embodied Barley in a unique and full way which doesn't sound so assured and rehearsed. And there was absolutely a combination of these two unique, undiscovered or untested voices to forge a stronger, more unique connection, give a more heightened set of performances that wouldn't feel like you're hearing familiar people. But finding them would have required Onward risking something it apparently deemed too important to potentially fail at. And so we get two pretty good performances from two comfortable actors who pretty much work well enough with each other to serve the story. They do fine, but I don't think either actor actually suits their part, and I can quite easily imagine alternative voices for both of them. This is not the case with any other younger characters in Pixar's history, and maybe it's not a problem, but it's a difference in the bones, and it kind of matters to me. But this is the call that Onward has made every single time. It lives and dies by its ability to sell its comfortable, safe choices well. Consistency is great sometimes, comfort is great sometimes, and not every Pixar movie needs to absolutely push all the boundaries. I'm not wanting to punish Onward for this, just saying this is the quality of film you get when you give the world's best 3D animation studio room to flex, but nothing actually interesting to execute. I've always had a very keen interest in voice acting, and definitely think this aspect of the film is probably the bit I have the biggest problem with. But not because it's done badly, I just think that particular risk might have been the thing that Onward should have fucked around to find out about. Everywhere else is very safe. The moments are sold well and the film is whole and good. Octavia Spencer is fantastic as the Manticore, but if there was going to be one place where Onward, I think, could have done something a little bit bolder, could have made the safe call everywhere else in order to justify its big risk somewhere, it would have been the casting of Ian and Barley. I can't say it would have turned out better, but it might have turned out different, it might have turned out interesting, and it wouldn't have been as comfortable. And maybe that spark was something it needed somewhere. And I'm pretty confident that making those slightly bolder choices, even if it's just 3 or 4 of them, within a largely formulaic story, can really make a difference. Because it's exactly what the next entry did. But you're gonna have to wait for that. Well, hey there! Thank you so much for being here and watching another episode of Pixar quality. I really hope you enjoyed it. I'm making a whole bunch of these episodes before even releasing them. I have no idea how it's going, if anyone's even watching, but if you wanted to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share the project around, that'd be swell as all heckin' hell. But what do you think of these Pixar entries? Maybe you really like Soul, maybe you really like Brave, maybe you really like Onward. Let me bloody know what you bloody reckon down in those comments below. Thanks for being here. My name's Micah, and I'll see you next time.